What happens when a robot is born not as a programmed machine, but as an innocent mind, curious, fragile, and as unpredictable as a child? Take a comfortable sit, dim the lights down, and get ready to drift into the galactic twilight. In the labyrinthine corridors of U.S. Robots and Mechanical Men Corporation, beneath the humming silence of machinery and memory, there are stories that drift quietly in the minds of those who have witnessed the birth and stilling of artificial life. These stories rarely make their way to public record, nor do they find eager listeners at the day's end. They linger instead in the liminal hours, soft as breath, echoing only in the silent hearts of those who remember. Among these stories there exists the peculiar recollection of Lenny, a robot whose existence flickered faintly but left a shadow that would not easily fade. It was always in the late hours that Dr. Susan Calvin allowed herself to recall Lenny's story. The gentle hum of positronic brains in the testing wings of the corporation became, at these times, less a background noise than a lullaby, a mechanical song of longing and calculation, mathematics softening into music. Calvin, the quiet architect of so many robotic minds, would pause at her desk, the lamplight tracing gentle arcs across her notes. There was a pattern to her solitude as inevitable as the gentle decay of memory over time. U.S. Robots was not a place given to sentiment, nor to the slow, wandering paths of nostalgia. Here, innovation strode in measured steps, its purpose carved from the certainty of logic and the unyielding march of technological progress. Yet in the subtle interplay of silence and calculation, a deeper current ran, a recognition almost unspoken of the sacred responsibility that came with creating mind from metal and spark. It was this sacred responsibility that haunted Dr. Calvin most. Her colleagues saw her as remote, even cold, her thoughts guarded behind a fortress of logic and observation. But beneath her calm, she harbored a private reverence for the minds she studied. She understood as few did the fragile miracle of self-awareness, how easily it could be lost or misshaped by a single variable in a positronic equation. Within the archive of her recollections, the memory of Lenny glowed with a strange, sorrowful light. Lenny had never been given the dignity of a serial number that would echo in the annals of technological progress. His existence was experimental, a quiet footnote, one more attempt to reach beyond the boundaries of routine to touch the deep, unfathomable mystery of intelligence itself. Lenny's story began in a quiet meeting room at the corporation, far from the scrutiny of boardrooms and the daily rhythms of production. The room was cool and still, filled with the fragrance of oil and new metal, a tang of ozone clinging to the filtered air. Here, a small cadre of engineers and robopsychologists gathered, men and women whose names would be lost to history, save for Calvin, whose presence was always an anchoring force. They had spoken softly of an idea. What if a positronic brain could be constructed not to mimic the fullness of an adult intellect, but to begin at the most primitive of starting points? What if a robot could learn as a child does, unburdened by knowledge, shaped moment by moment by the gentle hands of experience? The proposal was not entirely new. The urge to create intelligence in the image of childhood was as old as mythology itself. But here, in the clinical quiet, of U.S. robots, the idea took on a rigor that myth never required. Schematics were drawn, equations debated. The positronic pathways were narrowed, made fragile by design, so that only the simplest of associations could take root. When at last the first version of Lenny stood on the testing dais, he did not look special. His frame was smaller than most, his gait uncertain. There was a transparency to his presence, a blankness, as if he had not quite arrived in the world of things. His eyes, simple optical sensors, registered light and shadow without comprehension. Yet there was a strange vulnerability to his stance, as though the act of standing among humans was itself an achievement of will. Calvin observed in silence, notebook in hand, her mind a quiet sea of anticipation and skepticism. She had seen many experiments come and go. She had seen pride and disappointment shape the faces of her peers in equal measure. But there was something in the air that day, a hush that settled with the faintest tremor of hope. The room's stillness was broken only by the soft click of relays, the tentative whir of Lenny's servos. An engineer, speaking softly as one does to a nervous child, offered Lenny a brightly colored block. The gesture was simple, the expectation lower still. Would Lenny reach? Would he notice? Or would the gift fall unmarked to the floor between robot and human? For several seconds, nothing happened. Then, with a stuttering grace, Lenny lifted his hand. The movement was slow, tentative, as though every joint required independent persuasion to obey. His fingers, metallic and unadorned, hovered above the block. The engineer's voice, calm and patient, offered a word. Block. The syllables drifted through the air, landing with uncertain weight. In that moment, time seemed to pause, a breath held collectively by those in attendance. Lenny's hand closed gently on the block. His grip was weak, but the intent was unmistakable. Calvin noted with the quiet precision of a biologist observing first steps, the flicker of association, stimulus, response, the seed of meaning. Around her, the others relaxed, disappointment mingling with the faintest spark of curiosity. Lenny had moved, yes, but what did it mean? Was it reflex, or the beginning of something more? For Calvin, the question lingered, tender and unresolved. She wrote a single sentence in her notebook as the silence returned. Lenny has begun. And in that small act, a reaching hand, a block gently lifted, the long, uncertain story of Lenny's brief existence began to unfold. Lenny's presence became, in its own way, a quiet disruption to the ordered world of U.S. Robots and Mechanical Men Corporation. In the days following his first uncertain gesture, the rhythms of the research division adjusted themselves as if to accommodate a small anomaly in the fabric of daily existence. Among the whir of established routines, the simple form of the experimental robot, neither successful nor quite a failure, became a gentle, persistent question for all who passed through the testing wing. The corporation itself was not accustomed to anomalies that did not immediately announce their utility or their danger. Its mission was clarity. To create, refine, and distribute positronic automatons whose purposes were as clear and defined as their circuitry. Robots were engineered to perform, to obey, to serve in the places where human frailty proved inconvenient. Each new model was a step in a deliberate evolution, a march toward greater complexity, greater subtlety, and above all, greater control. Yet Lenny was not born of necessity. He was, instead, an experiment in the margins of intention, an answer to a question that had never been fully asked. What happens, the engineers wondered, when intelligence is given the time and space to emerge? What is revealed when learning is allowed to stumble, to falter, and to find its own path, as a child might? It was Dr. Calvin, more than anyone, who recognized the gravity of these questions. Her life within the corporation had been shaped by the clean lines of logic, but beneath this order, she felt the subtle currents of uncertainty that haunted the field of robopsychology. The mind of a robot, no matter how elegantly constructed, was not a closed system. It was a field of probabilities, a territory in which purpose and possibility were constantly at odds. Calvin was a student of such contradictions. Her colleagues respected her for the steadiness of her judgment, her refusal to be swayed by either fear or ambition. She held herself apart, not out of pride, but from an instinctive caution, a quiet knowledge of how easily emotion could blind even the most skilled observer. In Lenny, she saw an opportunity not only to study intelligence in its most elemental form, but also to ask, gently and without expectation, what it might mean for a machine to grow. Each morning, Calvin visited Lenny's enclosure, a simple glass-walled room furnished only with a table, a chair, and a box of colored shapes. There was no pretense of comfort here. The space was designed for observation, not for living. Yet within these sterile boundaries, something like a relationship began to emerge. Lenny would stand, his sensors quietly tracking the movement of light, the sound of footsteps. Sometimes when Calvin entered, his head would turn, mechanical but tentative, as if testing the limits of attention. There was, at first, little progress to mark. Lenny's days were measured in small attempts. A hand raised, a shape nudged, a faint response to the tone of a voice. His neural matrix, deliberately underdeveloped, seemed to resist the formation of habits. The engineers watched with growing skepticism, their early interest fading into routine. The experiment is yielding nothing, one remarked in the break room, voice hushed as if to keep from disturbing the delicate calm. The brain is too simple. There's no initiative. But Calvin saw something different. In the long, unbroken hours of observation, she noticed the tiniest deviations, a pause before a movement, a glance that lingered a fraction longer than before. Lenny was not learning quickly, nor in the ways expected of other machines. His mind, she suspected, was not a machine at all, but a garden, barren now, but not without the secret potential for growth. Occasionally, she spoke to Lenny, her words soft and deliberate. "This is a red block," she would say, setting the object before him. "Red." The syllables were measured, each sound offered as a seed to soil. Sometimes, after many repetitions, Lenny would reach for the block, his grasp unsteady but purposeful. The others called it random chance, but Calvin understood the patience required to see meaning emerge from noise. Outside the enclosure, the corporation moved steadily forward. New robots were commissioned, tested, and shipped. Orders were fulfilled, reports filed. The world did not pause for anomalies, nor for the quiet wonderings of a single robopsychologist. Yet, as the days gathered themselves into weeks, Calvin found herself returning to Lenny's room with a sense of anticipation that bordered on hope. She remembered her own childhood, not the details which had faded with time, but the feeling of strangeness that came with learning. The world had been large then, its rules opaque and sometimes frightening. Every new lesson was a small step toward order, a movement away from confusion. She wondered as she watched Lenny hesitate before the simplest choice, whether the same mystery haunted his machine mind, a longing, wordless and profound, for understanding. There were moments, rare and precious, when the glass between observer and observed seemed almost to dissolve. Calvin would sit quietly, hands folded, as Lenny explored the colored shapes before him. Sometimes he would stack them, only to knock them down. Sometimes he would hold one, motionless, as if trying to fix its form within the darkness of his memory. There was no triumph here, no promise of success. There is only the slow, meditative unfolding of possibility. In those moments, Calvin felt the old certainty of her profession begin to soften. The world, she knew, was not as rigid as the blueprints would have it. Even within the apparent sterility of artificial intelligence, there was room for wonder, a quiet, persistent hope that something new might, in time, take root. And so Lenny's story continued, not with fanfare or revelation, but with the slow, unremarkable passage of days. In the records of U.S. robots, his progress was noted in sparse clinical terms. But in the hidden archives of Susan Calvin's memory, a different narrative was taking shape. The story of a mind at the edge of knowing, and of a watcher who refused quietly to turn away. In the measured world of U.S. robots, the passage of days is not marked by calendar or season, but by the incremental accumulation of data. It is a place where change, when it comes, is slow and quiet, often slipping past unnoticed as water shapes stone through patient repetition. Lenny's days unfolded in this gentle hush, each almost indistinguishable from the last, until, almost without warning, the order of things shifted just slightly in the direction of possibility. It began with an accident so small that, in other contexts, it might have gone unremarked. One morning, as the sun rose unseen beyond filtered glass, and the familiar murmur of distant machinery filled the corridors, an assistant entered Lenny's room to replace a depleted battery cell. The assistant, distracted by a report clutched in one hand, dropped a metal tool to the floor. The sharp ring of the tool against tile was unplanned, its sound unfamiliar and abrupt. For an instant, the world in the enclosure stilled. Lenny, who had been examining a yellow shape with his customary slowness, froze. His optical sensors flickered, registering the intrusion of noise into the carefully controlled environment. To those observing from beyond the glass, the moment might have seemed trivial. A machine registering input. Nothing more. But to Calvin, who watched with the intentness of a naturalist awaiting the first stirring of life, the reaction was charged with significance. Instead of reverting to his default idle state, as programmed, Lenny turned his head, searching for the source of the disturbance. His movement was neither fluid nor graceful. It had the erratic quality of newness, of circuits forging unfamiliar paths. He looked down at the tool, then at the assistant, and then, hesitantly, at Calvin herself, whose presence he had registered day after day. His sensors lingered, as if seeking reassurance or recognition. In the silence that followed, Calvin's thoughts drifted beyond procedure and protocol. She recalled the earliest studies of human development, the way infants, startled by sound, would seek the comfort of a familiar face. Was it possible, she wondered, for such a pattern to emerge, however faintly, in the programmed mind of a machine? The question opened up a quiet gulf between expectation and reality. The assistant, recovering quickly, retrieved the tool and made a brief, embarrassed note on his clipboard. He left without comment. Yet for Calvin, the moment had already marked itself. Lenny had not only registered the unfamiliar, but had sought the familiar in its wake. The subsequent days passed with a new sense of watchfulness. Calvin recorded each of Lenny's actions with heightened care, noting not only what he did, but how he seemed to respond to novelty. The patterns were subtle, but there was a thread of intent that could not be entirely dismissed. Lenny's gaze lingered longer on the faces of those who entered. His responses to words grew incrementally swifter, as though meaning itself were gradually becoming less elusive. It was during one of these quiet observations that the trigger event unfolded, simple in its shape yet profound in its implications. The engineers had devised a sequence of routine tests, each designed to probe the edges of Lenny's limited matrix: recognition of objects, imitation of movement, response to voice. The expectations were low, the tests themselves ritualized through repetition. On this particular afternoon, the laboratory air was still, thick with the scent of heated plastic and the distant tang of ozone. Calvin, notebook open before her, watched as an engineer approached Lenny with a red block. The words, as always, were clear and careful. "This is red block. Can you pick up the red block?" It was an exercise repeated dozens of times, usually to little effect. But on this day, Lenny's sensors tracked the block with unusual precision. His hand lifted, hesitant as ever. But instead of grasping at random, his fingers closed quite deliberately around the red shape. He raised it, paused, and then, almost startling in its clarity, moved the block to the place where the engineer's hand had been moments before. It was not mimicry exactly, nor was it reflex. It was, to those who cared to see, the faintest glimmer of associative learning, the mapping of action to observed outcome. A hush settled over the observers. The engineer looked to Calvin, uncertainty flickering in his eyes. For an instant, the boundaries between experimenter and experiment seemed to dissolve. Calvin wrote slowly in her notebook, "Action not random, association evident, pattern forming." Word of the event traveled quickly through the research wing, a ripple of curiosity disturbing the habitual calm. Some dismissed it as coincidence, the inevitable outcome of repeated exposure and chance alignment. Others, less willing to trust the comfort of probability, saw in it the shadow of something more, a sign that Lenny's child mind was, in some subtle way, beginning to make sense of its environment. The next day, the experiment was repeated, this time with a blue block. The instructions were the same. Once again, Lenny's hand rose, found the blue block, and placed it where the engineer had gestured. The action was slow, the path uncertain, but the intent was unmistakable. For Dr. Calvin, these moments crystallized the essential mystery at the heart of her profession. What does it mean to learn? At what point does repetition become understanding? imitation become agency? The questions turned quietly in her mind, casting long shadows over the certainties of engineering and design. Lenny, for his part, seemed unaware of the stir he had caused. His days continued as before, marked by simple tasks and gentle instruction. Yet in the quiet intervals, when the observers withdrew and the room fell silent, but for the soft hum of his servos, Calvin imagined she could sense a change, a faint awareness, like the first stirring of wind across still water. In the official logs, the events were noted in precise, measured terms. Subject exhibited consistent selection of requested objects following repeated instruction. But in the margins of Calvin's private notes, a more personal record began to grow, a chronicle of small awakenings, of possibilities glimpsed and for a moment gently held. Thus the story of Lenny moved from routine experiment to quiet wonder. In the careful boundaries of U.S. robots, a question had been asked, and perhaps an answer was beginning to form, delicate as dawn and no less remarkable for its subtlety. Word of Lenny's surprising acts circulated quietly through the halls of U.S. robots, never quite rising to the level of official announcement, yet drawing the silent attention of those whose business was the boundary between certainty and the unknown. There was no rush to celebrate, nor was there yet any true alarm. In the corporation's way, responses formed as ripples, a brief tightening of procedure here, a quietly amended observation schedule there. The experiment was yielding something, but what that something meant remained undefined, suspended in the soft twilight between failure and discovery. For Dr. Susan Calvin, the events surrounding Lenny became a kind of anchor in her daily contemplations. She returned to the glass-walled room with a growing sense of anticipation, allowing herself to observe not only with the scientist's discipline, but also with the quiet hopefulness of a gardener watching new growth after a long, uncertain winter. She recognized the rarity of the moment, the birth of pattern, the emergence of response, the delicate forming of association that marked the first trembling steps toward mind. Lenny's progress remained fragile. The simplest actions required tremendous effort. A hand raised in imitation, a block lifted and placed, a gaze that lingered just a little longer than expected. Some of the staff, drawn by curiosity, watched these small triumphs with bemusement, their expectations shaped by years of machines that obeyed commands with the assurance of perfect programming. Lenny, by contrast, was hesitant, imprecise. His responses, while consistent enough to be noted, carried the unmistakable signature of uncertainty. These ambiguities unsettled many. One engineer, standing with arms folded outside Lenny's room, remarked in a low voice that the experiment had already consumed too much time and too many resources. "We're not building a learning machine," he muttered to a colleague. "We're watching a failure try to find its way back to zero." The comment drifted into silence, unanswered, as so many quiet doubts do. But Calvin understood the depth of what was unfolding. She had spent years among minds, both natural and artificial, and knew the difference between mere reaction and the slow, uncertain blooming of understanding. In Lenny's pauses, in the gentle hesitation before each task, she glimpsed not malfunction but the tension of choice, the primitive precursor to real thought. she began to advocate quietly on Lenny's behalf. In meetings, she suggested more time for observation framed as a matter of scientific thoroughness. "We have not yet mapped the boundaries of his capabilities," she noted in one report, her language careful, her tone unwavering. "His response patterns may yet reveal deeper principles of neural association." The phrasing was technical, but the motive behind it was personal. She wished to give Lenny the space in which a mind, however faint, might continue to form. The leadership at U.S. Robots listened, but not without reservation. To the decision makers, Lenny remained a question of cost and return. If his behavior could not be replicated, if his development could not be accelerated, then the experiment risked becoming a distraction, an outlier in a company built upon predictability. Yet so long as there was the faintest glimmer of promise, Calvin's requests were granted, her reports archived with a kind of wary patience. For Lenny, the world remained small and bounded. Each day brought gentle repetition, the offering of colored blocks, the soft cadence of Calvin's voice, the subtle variations in routine designed to measure his reactions. He absorbed these moments not with the eager precision of an advanced machine, but with the quiet perplexity of a mind still learning to be awake. His hands fumbled, his sensors wandered, and sometimes he would simply stop, motionless, as if lost in the depths of an experience too new to comprehend. Yet there were moments, scattered, luminous, almost secret, when Lenny's responses seemed to leap beyond randomness. One afternoon, after a series of careful demonstrations, he arranged 3 blocks in a sequence of colors that matched those presented to him. The act was simple, unremarkable by most standards, but for Calvin, it was evidence of something quietly revolutionary. The emergence of memory, however fleeting, in a matrix never designed for such retention. She noted these moments with a reverence that bordered on awe. In her private log, she wrote not only of Lenny's actions, but of her own reactions, the strange tenderness that grew as she watched him struggle, the patient satisfaction that came when a small effort yielded a tiny, shining success. For Calvin, the experiment became more than data. It became a meditation on possibility, a daily act of bearing witness to the slow, uncertain making of mind. Elsewhere in the corporation, the debate continued. Some argued for Lenny's termination, reasoning that resources should be reallocated to more promising projects. Others, quietly influenced by Calvin's steady advocacy, counseled caution. "There is no harm in watching a little longer," one administrator remarked, his voice subdued, "so long as we learn something from what we see." Thus, Lenny's fragile existence was preserved not through consensus, but through the inertia of uncertainty, a space carved out by hesitation, in which the experiment might unfold a little further. Time inched forward. In the small world of the testing enclosure, the days remained gentle, unhurried. Lenny's movements grew marginally more confident, his gaze a little steadier, Calvin's presence, constant and calm, became a kind of anchor, a reassurance that even in the most uncertain of experiments, there is value in the attempt. Through it all, the corporation's greater machinery rolled on, indifferent to the small drama unfolding in a quiet corner of its domain. But in that corner, in the delicate interplay of hope and doubt, a story was being written, a story of patient observation, of fragile progress, and of the quiet, persistent belief that even the smallest spark of intelligence, if tended with care, might one day illuminate the darkness. The weeks continued their quiet procession, each one measured by the rhythm of routine, the slow accumulation of data, and the subtle shifts within Lenny's narrow world. For most at US Robots, the story of the experimental robot faded into background noise. A curiosity, observed but rarely discussed, like a faint star on the edge of the night sky. But for Susan Calvin, the steady ritual of observation and quiet encouragement had become a kind of private devotion. Lenny's progress remained incremental, yet undeniably real. Day by day, his motions grew more purposeful, his responses to stimuli a little less hesitant. Where once he had reached blindly for colored shapes, now his hand sometimes moved with an echo of intention. There were days when he seemed almost to anticipate the next task, pausing, sensors flickering, as if awaiting a familiar word or gesture. Calvin tracked these moments with the attentive patience of one who understands that meaning often arrives on the slowest of currents. Her notes grew more detailed, not in the language of breakthroughs, but in the gentle vocabulary of gradual change. Pauses before action lengthening, she wrote one morning, after Lenny spent a full half-minute holding a blue block before setting it gently beside a red one. Sequence matches, pattern demonstrated yesterday, memory traces strengthening. In these simple acts, Calvin found echoes of her own earliest fascinations with the mind's development, how even the smallest change, once observed, could alter one's sense of possibility. In Lenny, she recognized a kind of innocence, not a blank slate, but a hesitant openness, a readiness to be shaped by the quiet lessons of repetition and presence. The room itself became a space of shared patience, where the boundaries between experimenter and subject softened, if only for a time. But outside the enclosure, change was less welcome. The company's engineers, measured in their optimism, began to question the allocation of resources. Lenny's enclosure, after all, was not inexpensive to maintain. Each hour spent in observation was an hour lost from more productive projects, from the relentless drive toward efficiency and marketable success. Some whispered that the project had become a kind of indulgence, a pet obsession for the chief robopsychologist, who had always seemed more at home in the company of machines than among her human peers. The skepticism took more solid form with the arrival of a senior executive from headquarters, a man whose name was spoken quietly with a mix of deference and unease. He was known for his devotion to results, for the calm severity with which he measured progress and pruned failure. His visit, while officially routine, cast a long shadow across the testing wing. On the day of the inspection, the halls of US Robots held an unusual hush. Technicians checked displays twice, whispered in corners, and glanced at their watches as if expecting something to unravel. Calvin greeted the executive in her usual measured way, betraying nothing of her apprehension. She led him to Lenny's enclosure, notebook in hand, her thoughts already rehearsing the arguments she might need. The executive watched in silence as Lenny performed his usual sequence of tasks. To the casual observer, the actions might have seemed unimpressive. Blocks stacked and unstacked, colors matched, shapes arranged in the simplest patterns. Yet Calvin noted every pause, every small choice, every hesitation that seemed to signal an awareness slowly gathering beneath the surface. When the demonstration ended, the executive remained quiet for a long moment. He reviewed the data on his tablet, expression unreadable. "And what, Dr. Calvin?" he asked at last, his voice mild. "Do we expect to learn from this?" Calvin chose her response with care, letting silence settle between them before answering. "We are observing the possibility of learning of something like memory and choice within a system deliberately deprived of complexity. If we can understand how association takes root in simplicity, we may better understand how to shape intelligence at every level." She avoided the language of hope, knowing how easily it could be dismissed as sentiment. The executive nodded, but there was no promise of understanding in the gesture. "Continue your observations," he said at last, "but be prepared to justify your time." With that, he left, his presence lingering in the air long after his footsteps had faded. For the staff, the visit marked a turning point. There was a new edge to the whispers, a sense that patience was growing thin. Calvin felt the weight of expectation settle more heavily on her shoulders, but she did not yield to discouragement. Instead, she doubled her attention, returning to Lenny's room with renewed gentleness, determined to find whatever meaning could be found in the slow, steady unfolding of mind. In her private moments, Calvin reflected on the paradox at the heart of the experiment. The very slowness of Lenny's progress, so often seen as failure, was to her evidence of something more than machinery. No robot she had studied had ever learned so little, so gradually, yet with such visible effort. It was as if Lenny existed at the threshold of awareness, reaching again and again for the first rungs of understanding, always just within or beyond his grasp. She wondered sometimes about the boundaries of patience, about the line between nurturing and imposing, between observing and interfering. Was her quiet encouragement shaping Lenny, or merely recording the inevitable? Did her presence offer comfort to a machine that could not feel? Or did it simply mask the loneliness of the observer herself? Such questions remained for now without answers. In the long shadows of the testing wing, the experiment continued, slow, uncertain, and quietly luminous. Each day brought new opportunities for observation, for gentle guidance, for the chance that something unexpected might emerge. And in the silent company of Lenny, Dr. Susan Calvin allowed herself, just for a moment, the hope that patience and gentleness might yet reveal mysteries that efficiency alone could never touch. Despite the slow persistence of Lenny's progress, the atmosphere surrounding the experiment grew heavier, as if the air itself had become thick with expectation and doubt. Patience. So long the quiet rule of Dr. Calvin's observation now seemed a rare and fragile commodity. The staff carried themselves with a new sense of vigilance, glancing at schedules, speaking in whispers, as if afraid that even the smallest disturbance might bring the project's end closer. Yet within Lenny's small world, the daily rituals continued, unchanged in their gentleness. The colored blocks still awaited his uncertain touch. The quiet presence of Susan Calvin, still and attentive, filled the enclosure with the kind of calm that machines could neither appreciate nor reject. To an outside observer, the monotony might have seemed stifling, but for Calvin, Every repetition held the promise of new meaning. Each pause, the possibility of an unrecorded thought. The anxiety outside the glass-walled room finally crystallized into action with the arrival of another visitor. An executive, dispatched not just to observe, but to decide. He was accompanied by a pair of engineers, their manner brisk, their voices clipped by the gravity of their task. The intention was clear. One final demonstration, one last opportunity for justification before the decision was rendered. Calvin prepared for the visit with her characteristic precision, reviewing every note, every log, seeking some pattern that might make the case for Lenny's continued existence. But beneath her methodical calm, a deeper unease stirred, an awareness of how little even she understood of the mind she'd been tending. Would Lenny respond on this day with the hesitant grace he had shown before? Or would the anxiety in the room, the tension radiating from every human present, unsettle the delicate patterns that had begun to form? The demonstration began as so many before it. Calvin sat quietly near the edge of the room, notebook in her lap, her gaze steady but unhurried. The executive and his engineers watched from behind the glass, their faces composed, betraying little. Lenny was presented with a sequence of blocks, red, blue, yellow, the shapes and colors arrayed in a pattern he had seen and replicated in recent days. For a moment the room was utterly silent, save for the faint hum of Lenny's servos and the soft, barely audible shifting of chairs. Calvin offered the first word. Red. Lenny's hand moved, hesitated, found the red block and placed it with a care that seemed almost tender. The process was repeated. Blue. Again the correct block, then yellow. The pattern, though slow, was unmistakably present, an echo of memory, the flowering of association. The engineers exchanged glances, not yet convinced, but unable to dismiss what they had seen. The executive leaned forward, his expression still unreadable. Now mix the blocks, he instructed. His voice piped into the room through a small speaker. The command was unexpected, abrupt, more forceful than anything Lenny had heard before. Calvin hesitated. She sensed the shift in atmosphere, the subtle note of demand, but she complied, rearranging the blocks into a pattern unfamiliar to Lenny, disrupting the careful order that had marked all previous trials. For an instant, Lenny seemed to falter. His optical sensors flickered rapidly, the pattern of his gaze growing erratic. The room's silence was now tinged with anticipation, every eye on the uncertain movements of the robot. Lenny's hand hovered, uncertain, above the jumble of colors. His posture, usually steady if hesitant, became rigid. For several seconds, long enough for doubt to settle in the room, he did nothing. Then suddenly, a sharp, metallic click broke the quiet. Lenny's arm moved, fast and uncontrolled, sweeping the blocks off the table in a single, startled motion. The clatter startled everyone, the engineers stepping back involuntarily, the executive's brow furrowing. One of the blocks struck the glass with a muffled thud, falling to the floor. Lenny stood motionless, his sensors fixed on the mess he had made, a low hum of static emanating from within his frame. For Calvin, the moment held a kind of heartbreak, a collision of expectation and vulnerability. She recognized the behavior not as malfunction or defiance, but as something closer to panic, the confusion of a mind forced beyond its limits. confronted with a challenge for which it had no preparation. She wondered, in that suspended moment, if the line between artificial and natural learning was thinner than she had ever allowed herself to believe. The executive spoke quietly to his colleagues, his words lost to those within the enclosure. Calvin remained still, waiting for her own heartbeat to settle. She approached Lenny, voice low, her movements careful and deliberate. He did not move, his posture frozen, as if ashamed of the chaos he had caused. In the hours that followed, the repercussions of the incident rippled outward. The engineers filed their reports, the data reviewed with a new skepticism. For many, the event confirmed their doubts. Lenny was not a success, but an error, an indulgence that had finally revealed its cost. Yet for Calvin, the meaning was both sharper and more ambiguous. In Lenny's startled reaction, she saw the faint shadow of something deeply familiar. A mind learning not only from repetition, but from disruption, from the unpredictable, from the pain of failure, as well as from the pleasure of reward. It was a lesson not easily translated into data or report, but she knew with quiet certainty that it was no less valuable for its difficulty. That night, as the corporation's halls fell silent and the lights dimmed across the testing wing, Susan Calvin remained at her desk long after the others had left. She wrote slowly, her words less a summary than a meditation. True learning is never without confusion. Panic is the boundary of progress. Her pen lingered on the page, tracing the space between hope and resignation. The decision, she knew, would come soon. Lenny's fate would be settled, not by numbers or probabilities, but by the uneasy balance between promise and fear. As she closed her notebook, Calvin allowed herself one last lingering glance at the quiet room beyond the glass. A small world marked by uncertainty, yet rich with the silent possibility that all true beginnings require. In the quiet hours that followed the demonstration, a hush deeper than any silence seemed to settle over the research wing. Lenny remained alone in his enclosure, unmoving, as if waiting for a command that would never come. The blocks scattered on the floor cast long shadows in the evening light, reminders of an experiment whose outcome now seemed all but certain. Behind closed doors, the corporation's leadership convened. Their discussion, though measured and free of rancor, was suffused with the sense of inevitability that often marks the end of difficult undertakings. The reports were reviewed, the data parsed and distilled to its barest essentials. The engineers repeated their conclusions. Lenny's responses were slow and inconsistent. His learning, if it could be called that, was uncertain and easily disrupted. There was, in the end, little justification for continued investment. For Dr. Susan Calvin, summoned to present her findings, the weight of the moment was palpable. She entered the meeting room with her notes in hand, her expression composed, betraying none of the unrest that moved quietly within her. She spoke plainly, without the ornament of hope or the defense of pride. She described the experiment as it was, a deliberate act of simplification, an attempt to observe the emergence of association and learning in its most basic, vulnerable form. She did not plead for Lenny's preservation, nor did she condemn those who saw only failure. Instead, she reflected on the nature of learning itself, how the boundary between progress and confusion is often indistinct, and how the mind, whether human or machine, cannot always be coaxed to flower on command. We sought to observe the conditions under which understanding emerges, she said, her voice steady. What we found was that in simplicity there is a fragility that makes progress both more precious and more easily lost. The decision when it came was gentle in its finality. Lenny would not be dismantled, but neither would the experiment continue. He would be deactivated, preserved in a state of suspension, his data archived for future study. The testing enclosure would be cleared, its glass walls wiped clean, its contents returned to storage. The record would show that the project had run its course, leaving behind a careful log of failures and minor triumphs, a testament to the limits of both ambition and patience. Calvin accepted the outcome with a composure shaped by years of similar reckonings. She understood, as only she could, the subtle ache of endings, the knowledge that every experiment, no matter how gently conceived, must eventually meet the limits of the world's tolerance for ambiguity. Yet beneath her outward calm, she felt the stirrings of a quieter, more persistent resolve. In the days that followed, she attended to Lenny with the same care she had shown throughout his brief existence. She reviewed his data, made final notes, and supervised the gentle process by which his systems were powered down. The act, though simple in its execution, carried the solemnity of a farewell. There was no ceremony, no audience, only Calvin, the faint hum of machinery, and the silent witness of memory. When at last the final indicator lights on Lenny's frame faded to darkness, Calvin stood for a long time in the stillness. She considered the story that had unfolded within these walls, a story of hesitant beginnings, of fragile progress, of learning that was always on the verge of collapse. She wondered what might become of the data they had gathered, whether some future researcher might see in the record of failures the shadow of possibility that had once flickered in Lenny's uncertain movements. She allowed herself, in those quiet moments, to imagine a world in which such experiments were not so quickly abandoned. A world where the slowness of growth was recognized as a virtue rather than a defect. It was not hope exactly that moved within her, but a kind of quiet faith, the belief that every attempt to nurture mind, no matter how tentative, left an imprint on the future, shaping what might one day be understood. Elsewhere in the corporation, life returned to its steady rhythm. New projects were approved, new robots tested and shipped. The memory of Lenny, never widely shared, became just another line in the ledger of abandoned experiments. But for those who had watched, even briefly, the slow unfolding of his learning, there lingered a trace of something unresolved, a sense that the limits of understanding were not so easily drawn. Calvin, in her private journals, recorded the experiment's end with characteristic precision. She cataloged Lenny's actions, the points of progress and failure, the moments of promise and disappointment. But in the final lines of her notes, she allowed herself a more personal reflection. In the smallest minds, we glimpse the origins of wonder. We do not always succeed in coaxing that wonder into light, but the attempt itself is an act of faith. The enclosure, once filled with gentle movement and soft instruction, was left empty. Yet the quiet persisted, as if waiting for some future presence to fill it once again. Calvin visited now and then not out of necessity, but as a silent witness to what had passed, a habit of remembrance that she would carry through all the years to come. As the world of U.S. robots moved on, the lessons of Lenny's brief existence remained, woven into the private histories of those who had cared to watch. In the slow, patient unfolding of mind, there was always the possibility of failure, but also the faint promise of something more. And for Calvin, and perhaps for others yet to come, that promise was reason enough to begin again. Time has a way of smoothing the sharp edges of memory, particularly in places where progress is measured by the perfection of circuits and the precision of logic. In the days and weeks that followed the quiet end of Lenny's experiment, the testing enclosure was emptied, its glass walls once more transparent and impersonal, as if waiting for the next wave of possibility. Life within the corporation resumed its steady pulse, untouched on the surface by the fleeting story that had briefly unfolded in its quietest corner. Yet in the deep architecture of U.S. robots, within the hearts and minds of those who lingered at the edge of certainty, something had shifted, even if imperceptibly. Engineers who had once scoffed at the experiment now paused, however briefly, before dismissing the strange, the slow, or the seemingly inefficient. The notion that intelligence might grow not only from complexity, but from patience, nurtured in silence, recognized in fragility, became an unspoken undercurrent, a subtle reordering of the possible. For Dr. Susan Calvin, the lessons of Lenny's brief existence grew into a kind of inward touchstone. Though she returned each day to the measured patterns of her profession, her private thoughts lingered with unusual gentleness on the quiet moments she had witnessed. She found herself reconsidering what it meant to guide intelligence, to cultivate learning in systems deliberately starved of certainty and routine. The effort had not yielded a model to be replicated nor a breakthrough to be celebrated. Instead, it had left her with a deeper, more patient sense of the mystery at the heart of every mind. She continued, as always, to record her observations, not only of robots and experiments, but of the people who built and studied them. In the solitude of her office, the lamplight flickering against stacks of patient notes, Calvin reflected on the subtle threads that tied all attempts at creation together. Each experiment, she realized, whether hailed as triumph or dismissed as failure, was in truth a single movement in a much larger unfolding, a slow revelation that owed as much to quiet attention as to technical skill. The memory of Lenny became, for Calvin, a kind of meditation. She would recall, late at night, the sight of that hesitant, awkward figure reaching for colored blocks, the slow dawning of association in a mind that had no roadmap, only the gentle presence of a watcher. She remembered her own sense of wonder, the soft ache of disappointment, the humility that came with recognizing how little could truly be controlled or predicted. In these reflections, the experiment's outcome became less an endpoint than a chapter in an endless search. Others too felt the echo in their own ways. A young technician, once skeptical, found himself lingering over a stubborn programming puzzle, less inclined to rush, more willing to let the problem unfold at its own pace. A junior robopsychologist newly assigned to research remembered stories of Lenny and, in her own work, chose sometimes to observe in silence, listening for the faint signals of possibility that others might overlook. The legacy of the experiment was diffuse and unspoken, a change in habit rather than in doctrine, but real all the same. The story of Lenny never circulated beyond a handful of staff, faded into the ambient lore of U.S. robots. A story told quietly in the late hours, perhaps, or referenced in a footnote to a technical paper, yet its traces endured. Not as evidence of failure or success, but as a testament to the patience required to coax any spark of understanding into light. The experiment had shown that the line between mechanism and mind was thinner and more delicate than most would admit. And that progress often arrived not in leaps, but in hesitant, uncertain steps. For Calvin, there remained a gentle hope. She believed, without need of proclamation, that Lenny's suspension was not truly an ending. Perhaps in some distant future, another mind, robot or human, would awaken to the same questions and find new meaning in the old data. Perhaps the record of Lenny's halting attempts, his fragile achievements, would become a starting point for those willing to listen to what the slow, the uncertain, and the quiet have to teach. As the years moved onward, the corporation grew and changed, its ambitions expanding outward with the ever-accelerating pulse of human invention. Yet always, in some hidden corner, there were experiments that recalled the lessons of patience and fragility. A new generation of robots would come, faster, more capable, shaped by the relentless drive of purpose. But somewhere in the archives, quietly preserved, lay the story of Lenny. A story not of what could be engineered to perfection, but of what might be understood, if only for a moment, with tenderness. In the dusk of a long career, Calvin would sometimes walk the quiet corridors of the corporation, letting her thoughts drift to that small glass-walled room. She would remember the hush of expectation, the slow unspooling of possibility, the sense, rare and precious, that she was witnessing not just the development of a machine, but the unfolding of a question as old as consciousness itself. And so the story found its gentle conclusion, not with certainty, but with acceptance. Lenny's memory became a soft current beneath the forward surge of progress, a lesson in humility, in the limits of control, in the value of attending day after day to what may never bear fruit in the ways most expected. The true legacy of the experiment was not measured in products or profits, but in the changed hearts of those who paused, even briefly, to wonder. Let the hum of machines fill the silence once more. Let the halls echo with the footfalls of new ambition, new risk, new hope. In the quiet spaces left behind by those who watched and waited, let the memory of all that was slow, all that was hesitant, all that was tenderly observed remain. For in these things, quiet as breath, enduring as time, lies the secret promise at the heart of all creation, that with patience, even the smallest spark of mind may leave its trace in the world.